thank you for holding this hearing today. And thank you all for being here. I just finished in January 8 years as governor, and I had a variety of shootings. We had at the Pulse nightclub, we had individual whose father was an FBI informant who was, my understanding, supposed to be under FBI investigation or surveillance, killed 49 people. Then we had an individual that from Anchorage that went to the FBI office in Anchorage and said, I shouldn't have a gun, and then they gave it back to him, and then he came to Florida and pulled his gun out of his checked suitcase and killed 5 people in the airport. Then I had 17 people killed at Parkland. The FBI had a YouTube video 18 months before it happened. He said he was going to be a professional school shooter, and his name was Nicholas Cruz, the shooter, and nothing happened. Then, I think 35 days before the shooting, the FBI, the tip line, somebody called and said this guy, the shooter was going to shoot up a school, and it was never passed on to local law enforcement. And then finally, right before I finished, there was 3 people, I think it was 3 people killed in the yoga studio, and the information had gone to the FBI hotline, but not to the locals. I worked a lot with our fusion centers in a variety of issues, and they, at the state level, were working with FBI and other agencies, the U.S. Attorney, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They really did a good job. But there's something that's not working at the federal level that there was prior knowledge, and we had 4 mass shootings, and so many families, their lives have been completely changed because of this. So what ideas do you all have that we should be doing at the federal level? Is there something different that the FBI should be doing that they're not doing to try to stop this? Because in all cases, in those 4 cases, there was prior knowledge at in Washington, but it didn't happen at the local level. I don't know if Mr. Watts or Mr. Brand, if you want to start.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So what we've been discussing today is the fact that the threshold, the legal threshold that allows the FBI to conduct investigations is quite high for these kinds of general or vague threats that may result in violence. So if the threshold for legal action is quite high, logically we need more tools in the pre-criminal space, in the civilian space, to receive that information. If someone is, one problem is people often hear things and they don't either take it seriously, or if they're afraid to call the FBI with that information, they don't want to get somebody in trouble. So one, we need a place to capture those tips. That's a non-criminal justice entity, right, to increase reporting. 2, when people do call the FBI, but it doesn't hit the threshold for an assessment or a preliminary or a full investigation, the FBI needs to know it can turn to a civilian-led intervention team. And we don't invest in that.
Let me just stop here. Stop the clock. You're talking about, I want to ask the question, did what Senator Scott just talked about, did it meet that threshold or was it under the threshold?
A general statement that I want to, that Jews should be killed, that I want to become a school shooter, may not make a legal threshold for an investigation by the FBI. And in fact, if we put everybody under investigation who made a statement on social media,
I've got a gun, I shouldn't have it.
Again, can I add to that, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
If I may, just 10 seconds. If it may not reach the threshold for a federal criminal investigation or assessment, it should absolutely meet the threshold for perhaps a non-governmental organization or state and local authorities to conduct the type of things that this panel has been mentioned of interviews, engagements, mental health, social service, education providers, meeting and making contact.
So again, the question, Senator, I don't want to put words in the mouth, but there was a failure here. I mean, do we acknowledge there was a failure? I mean, you sit there and go, hey, you need more resources. But here's some examples where I would think we had legal authority. We could have done something. We didn't. And I think the key question there is, why not? And how do you prevent those types of law enforcement failures? Again, I'm not trying to beat up on anybody. I mean, I think Senator Scott's laying out a pretty convincing case.
May I contribute something from the recent experience in Texas with the El Paso shooting, my home state? The mother of the shooter had called local authorities, and it was a small police department with limited resources. limited training, hadn't gotten that push towards how do you do proper threat assessment in a situation like this. But the local officers went by and had a conversation. There was no basis for arresting somebody. We don't have, at least in Texas, we don't have red flag laws that might enable a process of civil action to remove someone's gun from their possession. That's a big part of the story. We haven't talked about that. We all understand how hard the politics are in that, but that's a big part of the story as well. It wasn't a civil commitment situation yet. There wasn't enough evidence for that. And yet, in retrospect, it's clear there was the tip, there was the warning, there was the opportunity for engagement. And I want to reinforce what Professor Braniff said. One of the things we could be doing that Congress could do effectively is to surge resources into the threat assessment mechanisms that are being developed and in some places deployed very effectively. I believe the Secret Service works closely with local school officials and school resource officers, as Mr. Watts mentioned. Those sorts of early warning signal systems are critical. And of course, we're now spread far beyond just terrorism.
But again, we had the early warning. But again, I apologize, Senator Scott. I just couldn't constrain myself. Senator Scott.
So I'm surprised so you really believe that if somebody has a video and they say they're going to be a professional school shooter, that shouldn't get sent down to the locals?
It's not a should, it's not a belief statement. When we look at our data, nearly 70% of domestic terrorist violent plots succeed. So they're not being interdicted by the criminal justice process. So I'm agreeing that.
But don't you think that they should have called the local FBI office in all those cases? I mean, well, the Anchorage one, they should, in my opinion, and you never get all the information, right? I've been asking for more transparency of how they handled this stuff, and I haven't gotten it from the FBI yet. But let's take this Parkland. I mean, that when you have the video and you have a hot tip that's going to happen, and it's somebody that's been arrested, I think 49 times locally, and they was told he couldn't bring a backpack into school because everybody believed he was going to be a school shooter. So that one, no one should have looked into it?
Senator, please, I don't mean to, I don't want to be misunderstood. It's certainly that there was opportunities for an interdiction. I would just like us to consider that not all interdictions are going to be possible via a criminal justice interdiction, and that we should think very hard about how aggressive we want our federal law enforcement community to be in investigating freedom of speech and freedom of association. This is one of the unfortunate the tensions within our Constitution, is that it affords a lot of speech, hate speech, including speech that encourages violence. And this is a really challenging debate for us to have. How aggressive do we want to be?
Well, what we did afterwards is we passed risk protection orders, where it still has to go through only law enforcement can do it. It has to go through the courts. You have to constantly review it. So we don't believe we've impacted somebody's due process rights. But we have got to figure out, all right. And what doesn't make sense to me is, why can't I get information? Because I get it. We ought to throw more money, because I've now been in this process now as a governor in here, and everybody wants more money. I get that's what they do. Is everybody comes to my office asking for more money. I get that part. But why wouldn't we want to fix a system? The cases that happen to me, that ought to be fixed. And I don't think just saying throw more money at it and have some privacy, have lower standards is the right fix. It seems to me that those cases, that's a big enough deal that the information should have been sent down locally.
Senator, can I quickly add to that? I don't disagree at all, right? That's a mistake. But I would also say that you might be shocked at the volume of tips and leads that come in to any, FBI office or DHS location, a fusion center, to where there is no real assessment mechanism. In international terrorism, we did do this. We did very rigorous assessment, even down to scoring systems overseas about who's got the potential to be, violent based on several factors. It's not done for mass shootings or suspects. We haven't gone back through that. Same thing, we did the militant ideology atlas. We looked at all of these factors in terms of what people were citing. We looked at all the evidence. It's not been done because there hasn't been a designation of a case or a terrorist group at the domestic level, so it's hard to put that together. So when you go to triage, it really just depends on who's on shift that day and what the backlog is. Sometimes that backlog, particularly after a violent incident like El Paso, might soar to 100 leads a day in an FBI office, which could create a lag that's enormous. And then you're just going through shifts. There's no real rigorous system for assessment, and it's just based on to that person that day and what they think they should go through. The other thing is with the social media part there, I don't agree with this, but there is pushback that you're ruining the lives of young people whenever you aggressively go after them for one posting they've done in social media. And so if I actually went out on the internet and sucked in every YouTube of a young person making a violent threat or some claim, we would maybe run down hundreds of young people every day. I agree, there was many warnings and indicators there. Omar Mateen is another example. We should have had some handoff mechanism with state and local, to make that transition. I also don't feel like we've made those triage systems and a good method to hand off to state and local so that they would know. That could be Boston bombing, Omar Mateen, Las Vegas, 1,000 different examples. And so we could help them do that, but I think clearly defining what to look for around these threats, whether it's a school shooter, workplace shooter, white supremacist, incel, which is its whole brand new branch that's come up, I think that's extremely important to do.
Thank you.
Before I turn it over to Senator Sinema, I think, again, the whole purpose of this hearing is to understand the problem so we can determine, do we need additional authorities or different allocation or more resources? So, again, I'll ask the question. This, you said a mistake. I would call this, it seems to me, I think Senator Scott, this was a failure to use existing authorities. First of all, is that true? I mean, we already have, based on, again, let's just talk about Parkland. Here you had a video, you had a long history. And listen, I understand the volume. I don't think you have 100 threats like the perpetrator of Parkland come into the office. I would think that would be, like hair on fire alarms going off with that one. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's Mr. Watts.
Yeah, I would just say each assessment, regardless of how serious it seems when it first comes in the door, takes the same amount of time. So I just recall certain days when somebody would post something on the news and say this person may be in the U.S. and you're done for the day.
But again, that's like one notice. This was multiple notices over a very long period of time. So again, the question, you would admit that's a failure to utilize existing authorities. That's just glaring. Again, I'm really not.
Right.
How difficult this is,
Senator. I understand.
So we don't need to pass a new law to address that. We just need to make sure that we use existing authorities. Is that true?
Yes, I think it also comes down to what the FBI would investigate. Much of what the FBI gets pumped in terms of information, Parkland would be an example, maybe isn't something that they're immediately going to move on, but it would be for a state and local law enforcement. So I think it comes down to how does the assessment process get recorded and put into databases and managed, and then how is that triaged and transmitted down to state and local.
And Senator Scott, I'm going to join you in additional oversight letters to get this information from the FBI because we need to know what happened to assess this.
Yeah, because you want to get better. So what I did after Pulse, what we did is we added 46 counterterrorism experts at the state level. We added, I think it was about 6 or 7 in 6 or 7 different offices for state law enforcement. But again, the fusion centers work, but they got to get, the information's got to get there first. They work really well.
We're not beating up on law. We're just asking these legitimate questions. By the way, law enforcement, by and large, is a state function.